Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Bazubitz, President and CEO of the Royal, one of Canada's leading mental health and research centres. My team and I are very pleased to partner with Rogers TV Ottawa for another special edition of Conversations at the Royal during Mental Health Week. As a care, research, and teaching hospital, our goal is to bring the latest information on treatments and research findings in mental health to you, the public. At the Royal, we provide care to individuals from 16 years of age to the elderly, all who experience mental health challenges. We also serve veterans, active members of the Canadian Forces and the RCMP for operational stress injuries they might incur while serving our country on humanitarian missions. Every client at the Royal receives best-in-class care informed by cutting-edge research to live their best life. This week, you will hear from many of our amazing clinicians who are passionate about the care they provide and the research that will lead to novel treatments and new discoveries in mental health and addictions care. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Tony DeBono, a clinical psychologist in our youth mental health program. Tony brings a wealth of experience in his work with youth, having worked with sick kids and Hamilton Health Sciences Center. He is very passionate about helping youth who experience suicidal thoughts and who have important emotional challenges. He also brings an equitable lens to mental health care that addresses discrimination and racism in healthcare. He's also respected for his work in bioethics on important issues in pediatric to end-of-life care. Tony promotes a holistic approach to mental health, one that looks at the whole person, not just their mental health needs, but also recognizes their physical, social, and spiritual needs. When working with youth, Tony doesn't only consider their mental health, but the family's mental health. He has seen how this ongoing pandemic has had a significant impact on families in all spheres of life. Tony will explore some of the key dimensions of what is family mental health. As a caring practitioner, he won't simply relate information, but he'll also share some valuable take-home strategies that families can use for their own mental health and for their families' well-being. Thank you for joining us for Conversations at the Royal.
Welcome, folks, to Conversations at the Royal. My name is Tony DeBono, and I'm a psychologist in the youth program at the Royal Ottawa Mental Health Centre. Today, I want to talk about family matters, conversations to connect. An area that I'm quite passionate about is families and how families remain connected together, as well as how families can really buffer some of the stresses that we've all endured throughout this pandemic. So please join me for the next 50 minutes or so on this conversation about connection. Before we begin, I'd like to pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. Okay, so the pandemic has been filled with hard times for everyone. And if we could take a moment to reflect on the unprecedented times over the last 2 years, what have we faced? What have we lost? What have we come to suffer with? What have we come to live with? And how have we become more resilient? There's been a number of pieces written about the pandemic and its impact on children, youth, on families, on mental health more generally. And there's no shortage of information about how the pandemic has really impacted families and the stresses across the family system, from children to caregivers and to others within the family. Now, our children and youth and families have particularly suffered, whether it's parents who have lost gainful employment, who are struggling socioeconomically, children who may not have been in school or their social lives, which are crucial for their development, have been impacted. Hobbies, extracurricular activities, these have all been impacted by the pandemic. And folks like sick kids, as well as groups of researchers, have really tried to tackle a crisis that had already been brewing before the pandemic. And that's the mental health crisis of youth as well as families. So this is not a new phenomenon. However, COVID-19 and the pandemic has really pushed all of us to our collective boundaries in terms of how we're able to cope with the multitude of stresses associated with COVID-19. And we do have academic research, including Dr. Valancourt and Dr. Satsmari, listed here on the impact of COVID-19 and the mental health of Canadian children and youth, if you'd like to check that out. So a quick caution. Before we proceed, the world in which we see is not a perfect depiction of reality. Our minds are not perfect. And of course, you see here on the slide a picture of Lady Justice, and particularly, we're going to go back to the concept of the scales. So at times, we all engage in thinking errors. Our brains have not grown and evolved and developed over time for perfection. They just haven't. Thinking skills tend to be really complicated. And we all have biases. So just notice the biases that you may already have coming into conversations, and notice how that impacts your relationships within your family. Before we get going into a little bit more of this presentation, I want to flag something for folks. It's an old concept known as the fundamental attribution error. And it goes like this. Okay. If there's something that happens and happens to me, or I do something, maybe I do something that's not completely in line with my values, an other looking to me might say, this has a lot to do with Tony's personality over the situation. So when I'm looking at somebody else, I'm probably focusing more on them as an individual versus the situational factors or context that may have impacted my behavior or decision. Now, here's the trick. When it comes to me, myself, I will overemphasize the situational factors involved in my behavior and maybe downplay some of the individual differences. This concept is known as the fundamental attribution error and is a really important concept to know whenever we're entering into conversations with folks, and particularly when we're entering into conversations with family members, because we tend to have such a robust history and linkage to our family members that we tend to have a lot of information about folks. So it's not surprising that our minds can jump to the fundamental attribution error, particularly with those who we might be a little bit more comfortable with. So my next question is, do your thoughts work for or against you? And here's a number of themes of thoughts that come up for folks. All or none thinking is one of them. Sometimes we talk about extremes, and we'll talk about this in terms of the scales again. Everything is either right or wrong. Either it's evil or good, right? So just seeing things in dichotomies or yes or no versus really acknowledging the gray in between. What about catastrophizing? The root of catastrophizing is the catastrophe. So for some folks, do you find that your thoughts maybe move you into the future, thinking about a catastrophe that may or may not happen? What about in relationships when we find ourselves reasoning based on how we feel? So I feel this way, therefore this must be the reality. We sometimes call that emotional reasoning. Other thoughts that may come up that you'd want to be attuned to are thoughts around labeling. Things like, this person is dumb or stupid. Really, when you're jumping to labels, it really kind of defeats the purpose of that nuanced conversation. But notice how quickly our minds jump to labels, in part because, again, we have those biases and those quick ways of thinking that sometimes work for us, sometimes work against us. And there's a number of different kind of thinking traps that are listed here. And if folks want to learn more about that, you may want to look up work around Judith Beck, who's listed here, or her father, Dr. Aaron Beck. Dr. Judith Beck is a psychologist, and Dr. Aaron Beck was one of the creators of cognitive behavioral therapy. Right? Sometimes you'll see the terms CBT, but something that you might want to look at for more information. But overall, really important to know, the mind is flawed. So by definition, as human beings, we will come in with our own thinking errors, whether it's jumping to extremes, all or none thinking. Clue words to kind of tap into, especially around all or none thinking. If you notice yourself saying always, everyone, never really often, just notice where that's coming from and see if there's a little bit more gray within the black and white. And of course, we rely on faulty assumptions at times. So things like mind reading. No, unfortunately, we cannot read minds and others can't read our minds. But unfortunately, we very much sometimes wish that folks could. So do your thoughts work for you or against you? So let's move now to maybe differing perspectives that folks have had, differing perspectives between family members. This pandemic and the sociocultural context that we're in has really driven us to extremes, right? And oftentimes we talk about misery lying at the extremes. So another author that I'll be talking about is Dr. Marsha Linehan. Dr. Linehan created a very particular type of therapy that looks at these types of extremes called dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT. Misery often lies in the extremes. I'd like you to take a moment and think about, when are you not your best self? So for some folks, maybe think about a time where maybe emotions were really high, really hot, at the exclusion of reason. So back to that emotional reasoning piece. I feel, therefore this is. So maybe really heavy on the emotion side and less so on the rationality side. What about the other extreme? Do folks find that maybe when they're engaging with family members, that sometimes they get way too analytical or highly analytical at the exclusion of emotion? Again, just notice when you're not at your best self. Where are you in terms of these extremes? Now notice, when are you at your best self? When are you living according to your values? When do you feel most in touch and aligned? Generally, I find for myself, that I'm my best self when I'm walking that middle path. So how do I both acknowledge emotion and the important information that emotions give us? And how do I also remain rational and using knowledge without becoming removed or dissociated from my actual bodily and emotional experience? So the wisdom here that we're going to be talking about is, can we, even with differing perspectives between family members, come towards what's called a synthesis, a bringing together of opinions, a bringing together of both the emotional and the cognitive mind, and coming together to be your best self and to connect with others. So dialectics is this formal term, and that's the base of the dialectical behavioral therapy that I mentioned in an earlier slide. Dialectics, if you don't know the term, will make you sound very smart at a dinner party. But the idea of dialectics, it comes from philosophy. There's a number of philosophers that have used dialectical thinking. It's essentially the premise that there are opposing forces or truths where folks can have a very strong opinion in one direction, others can have a very strong opinion in the other direction, and there is value and wisdom in the synthesis of both of those positions. Position 1, position 2, position 3. Well, why does this matter to us as family members and moving forward in terms of our own mental health? Well, multiple perspectives and ways to solve problems are part of the diversity of life. Also, even when we think that things are opposite, or when they are, in fact, appearing opposite, two things that are at the same time opposite can actually both be true. Two things that appear to be opposite can actually both be true. Think about maybe some of your closest loved ones where you both love and sometimes very much get upset with your loved one at the same time. These dialectics or these tensions exist. The only thing we know for sure as human beings is actually that change is a natural occurrence. Change is probably one of the only constants that we can bet on. So it's really important for us to take this step of seeing the world potentially through different eyes. We're going to be talking a little bit more about what that means. So here's some tips to connect with family members and maybe start to channel that I a little bit differently. When you are about to get into a conversation or a debate or a discussion with a family member, perhaps the next time you want to purposefully look for the kernel of truth in that other person's perspective. So even if you don't agree with the premise, even if you are struggling to connect with that family member, can you go and look for just that kernel of truth in the other person's perspective, looking at all sides and perspectives? And one way that could help with that is just the curious question, what's being left out in my understanding? What am I missing? Because the goal is, as family members, is to be connected. Connectedness is what we want more than anything as human beings, and our families can be such a strong source of connectedness that the goal is to look for truth by acknowledging both positions or aspects of both positions. Of course, the great Kendrick Lamar, rapper and artist, wrote the song called Humble, and remaining humble is kind of the name of the game. As human beings, I think we're learning over the last few years and over time through generations that nobody is the holder of absolute truth. And how do we live together with a diversity of opinions that can be valid, even if we don't agree, particularly with our family members? Some key tips and tricks. Words really matter. So when we go to connect with others, oftentimes I statements tend to land a little bit better when I feel a certain way versus you are, you should, those sorts of things. So while you're connecting with your family, just kind of notice that and maybe notice some of your own language tendencies. Remember, the brain gets wired into many different types of shortcuts that sometimes work for or against us. So if I could teach one skill or introduce one skill, validation is the way to go. Validation is something we all crave. And in fact, we're starving for validation. Validation's so important to our being, whether it's validation in terms of our emotional experience, validation of maybe some work that we've done. We're craving validation. And validation often comes, especially early on in life, from family members, but also throughout one's life. Validation and invalidation can really occur between family members quite quickly. What does it mean to validate? Brene Brown, the social worker and researcher, really talks quite a bit about validation, as does Marsha Linehan. Validation is about communicating to another that their thoughts, their emotions, and their actions are understandable given the situation. That sounds easy, right? Well, think about the last time maybe a loved one came to you, a family member came to you, and you may have had the urge to say, yeah, but your life's not that bad. Or have you thought about so-and-so down the street and what they're going through? Well, at least you have. So quickly we can jump to invalidation without really knowing it. Validation's really about how do we, one, take the perspective of our family member or that other. How do we sit out of judgment and staying out of judgment, knowing that our brains jump to judgment? How do we potentially recognize the emotion in another person? And then how do we communicate that? Now, validation is actually rather challenging. This is a skill. So if you find yourself struggling with validation, or if you find yourself jumping to, well, here are the facts, and I really want to make this point known, or this is why this point is incorrect, you will be in a good company in terms of the learning curve. Validation is something that is a skill that can be learned, and it takes practice. So for some folks, it may be easier than others, and it's a skill that can be learned. I oftentimes get told, well, Tony, if I validate my family member, that means I absolutely agree with them, and I don't agree with them. Well, it's a great point, and validation does not equal agreement. So I can validate your experience, your emotions, why your actions are understandable given the situation, and I can still not necessarily agree with you. So there is that distinction that validation does not necessarily mean agreement. But what validation does do is it actually forces us in that dynamic, the provider of the validation. It forces us to kind of get in touch with a particular vulnerability, for us to know what did that emotion feel like for us, or how could we imagine that emotion feeling for us. So it really is about walking alongside a family member or another, as opposed to pitying or providing sympathy. So there's a difference between feeling for somebody versus walking alongside somebody and feeling with them. So it's an important, vulnerability is an important factor in terms of making those sorts of connections and strengthening relationships in families. And on to my next slide. Why is validation important in family relationships? At its core, it's showing that you're listening. It's showing that you care. It's also showing that you can disagree without intense conflict. That we can actually walk alongside each other in a family with differing opinions, and we can still love, appreciate, and respect each other, even when we are noticing that we aren't completely aligned in opinion. Now, a quick note, there was a little star or an asterisk in the previous slide around behavior. So, and the reason why I put that around actions or behavior is the idea is you need to be genuine and true, and you want to only validate the valid. So emotions can always be validated. These are internal experiences for folks. Sometimes you may or may not validate an action or a behavior. At the end of the day, though, validation is about perspective taking. So how are you able to sit in the shoes of another? And how are you to potentially feel what it is that that person is feeling, and identifying and labeling that? So here's a step-by-step playbook for how you can validate a loved one. Step one, really listen. You might say, easy. Why is that even listed here? Let's think about the last time you really leaned in and listened. What weren't you doing? You probably weren't typing on your computer. You probably weren't listening to music. You probably weren't having 3 or 4 screens all up at once at the same time. Well, what were you doing? You likely were making eye contact, perhaps, right? Or you may have been sitting relatively close together or leaning in. You likely were not distracted by other things around you. You are what's called mindful, or really being in that present moment. While you're listening, it's really important to be aware of your reactions, both in terms of what you say, so choose your words wisely, but also in terms of what you don't say, but you present with your body. Nonverbal cues can present a whole bunch of information that our words never speak. So just be mindful of things like potentially your facial expressions or your posture, or those types of nonverbals that will either indicate that, yes, you are in line with this person, or it may potentially be a cue into step 3, which is around non-judgmentalness and compassion. So just notice that even if you are experiencing some thoughts of judgment, how do you return yourself back to that present moment to show compassion for your loved one? And then you want to communicate that you're taking them seriously. Maybe observe and take a guess in terms of what they're feeling. And you may get this wrong, and if you get it wrong, then be open to being corrected. We often will say not to mind read, and we talked about this earlier. In this case, making that guess, maybe considering an emotion that somebody's feeling and describing that reflection to them, opens the door to communication. It opens the door to learning more about how that person is feeling in that moment. And if you are incorrect, then you can pivot and move forward. Really important to know in terms of validation, oftentimes the labels, remember we talked about labeling earlier, labels are things you want to notice in your mind and probably think twice before using those terms. So labels that we talked about that can be invalidating, terms like manipulative or stupid or overreacting or attention seeking. These types of words oftentimes reflect judgment, and sometimes give the impression that perhaps the other is not worthy of your time or your respect. So be very mindful. Words matter, and you want to be very tactful in terms of how you approach validating somebody to really show that you do care and that you are able to take that person's perspective. Okay, so we talked about how do we validate somebody. Great. Before we validate others, we have to also be aware of validating of oneself. Maybe ask yourself this: who is your worst critic? How many of you are thinking, me, myself? Right? So self-invalidation is something that unfortunately is all too common in society. But the beauty here is that the same general formula applies. Listen to yourself. Without stuffing yourself with distractions, notice. What are your thoughts telling you? What are your emotions telling you? What does your body tell you in terms of physical reactions? But really listening to yourself, honoring yourself. It might be easier to describe emotions non-judgmentally when you are referring to a loved one or a family member. It's oftentimes quite difficult to describe your emotions non-judgmentally about yourself. Really important to know that non-judgmentalness has to also be reflected in oneself and oneself's behavior. And it's important to acknowledge that you are going to have emotions. Emotions are a natural and expected part of the human experience. And you are able to have emotions that are your own, and they are valid. So remaining compassionate and non-judgmental to yourself is really crucial, because if you're able to validate yourself, those techniques and skills apply very well to validating another. And vice versa. If you're able to validate another, again, these techniques can apply to oneself just as much as they can apply to another. Which leads me to my next point. And I use the depiction of the airplane, oxygen card, but this metaphor has never been truer. Before we can really help others, we really need to also make sure that we are taking care of ourselves. Within the family, within our families, our family unit, however that's defined, our families are going to need us as family members. And one of the ways for us to be our best selves is to make sure we're putting the oxygen mask metaphorically on ourselves first. So I really like to show this depiction, because when you look at this schematic, step 1 and step 2, for many caregivers, many family members, they would say, well, I would put the mask on the little one first. And of course, for those who are familiar with riding a plane, we know that the technique is to put the mask on oneself first, so that way you can actually help others. That metaphor is very important, especially when we're thinking about validating and connecting with our family. So here's some other tips and tricks that you might want to consider around really getting in control of your emotions and really being able to maximize your emotions to work for you as opposed to against you. And this isn't my set of skills. This comes from Dr. Marsha Linehan and Dr. Rathison Miller, who are dialectical behavioral therapy scientists and clinicians. And if you looked at this slide, you would say, I have many folks who tell me, Tony, you don't need a PhD to know this. And it's true. Some of this is just good old-fashioned, what our elders would tell us in terms of maintaining oneself. If you've got physical illnesses, make sure you're getting the appropriate treatment and care so that your physical self is secure. Well, something important about, in general, balance exercise. There's something really important around balance in sleep. There's something really important around balance in eating. Something really important about only taking medication that's potentially mood altering if it's prescribed to you by a prescriber, right? So of course, there are all individual situations, and this isn't meant for a specific person or for treatment. This is just to show that one of the most important skills, and we call this a skill. You would think that this is just, wow, this is so intuitive to all human beings. We teach this as a skill because it is so important, and so many of us find ourselves either not eating well, especially under stress, or perhaps not sleeping well, or perhaps indulging in alcohol, or maybe not exercising in a balanced way. These types of aspects of one's personhood are going to be, and internal core, are going to be really important in terms of how you're able to connect with another. So really important that you put that oxygen mask on first, so that way you are taking care of yourself. So what are your warning signs? What does your body tell you? What is the wisdom of the body? You've been in your body your whole life. You have a sense of when your body is sore, when your body is tired, when you're happy, when you're sad, when you're angry. Emotions give us a wealth of information about what's happening. Emotions communicate motivation internally. They communicate to others. They motivate us to move, or they motivate us to act. Emotions tell us a whole wealth of information. And unfortunately, for many of us, we find ourselves pushing down emotion when it starts to peak up. So being attuned and observing those warning signs around your emotions can be helpful. Back to the thoughts again. We talked a lot about thinking and that sort of stuff. Notice what your thoughts tell you. Do you tend to be more of a, in terms of the scales, more in that balanced thinking, but you're finding on this particular day that maybe your thoughts are getting really polarized? Maybe they're getting really sticky. And by that, I mean, sometimes you might have some thoughts or things you're thinking about that just stick. They don't go away. They kind of just continue to play out in your mind. Maybe you're finding yourself being more judgmental lately, or finding yourself relying on assumptions. Just notice. Your thoughts are also going to give you some potentially really important information about what's happening for you and where you are in terms of your psychological self. And lastly, what does your body tell you? Again, the wisdom of your body has been with you your entire life. When your energy level changes, what does that potentially tell you? Maybe your sleep, or level of perspiration, or muscle tightness versus relaxation. Know yourself, know your body, because your body will oftentimes give you really important information about where you are and what you're thinking and feeling. So knowing your warning signs, from emotion to thought to physical body, are all going to be really important in terms of knowing oneself, for you to be the best family member for the other or for another. And on a last note, so we've talked about communication. We've talked particularly about this idea of seeing the world maybe not in black or white, good or bad, yes or no, but the concept of the dialectic is really about taking both stances and trying to find kernels of truth and the wisdom of new understanding from both of those perspectives. Then we talked about validation and how we crave validation, how validation is so important to us as human beings, and how validation can really help us connect to other family members and also to connect with others. We also learned about how invalidation and self-invalidation can potentially be problematic and ways around that. So it is not by mistake that before we part today, I want to talk briefly about social media. As a family, it's going to be really important to be mindful of the media you consume and that your family consumes. Right now, social media is not particularly regulated. And by that, I mean social media can display a number of themes and content that could be helpful and create a sense of connection and community. But we also know, based on the data, that social media use in particular can be particularly harmful for adolescent girls, for example, for young people, for those who are already coming in with a number of risk factors. Social media can actually be harmful. It can be harmful for discussions and potentially even be harmful for the family relationship. Well, why? Remember that craving for validation again? That craving for connection? Social media kind of does that, doesn't it? At some level, maybe some groups, with some people. Let's think about what drives social media usage. Well, next time you post a photo or post a story, what is the hope or the aspiration that you're going to get? It's usually some sort of reinforcer. I see a like or a heart or a retweet or a comment or somebody shared this, but I get reinforced for that. We crave reinforcement. We want our voices to be heard, and social media provides that platform. Now, what about that whole idea of the dialectic again? And this idea of polarizing stances maybe not being all that they're cracked up to be. Is social media a place for nuanced discussions? Is it a place where we really see the gray? Is it a place where we can both love and challenge our family members, or support and challenge? Is it a place for nuanced conversation? And when I think about some of the most popular platforms, we're talking about a few hundred characters of text, perhaps an image, very popular now, short videos for about a minute, sometimes with voiceovers. But really, what we're talking about are brief bursts of opinion or knowledge or information, and it's not always so genuine. Well, let's think about what is that driver again, the reinforcer. If I am reinforced for extreme content or polarized content, and I get likes and I experience that as reinforcing, well, I'm more likely to do that again in the future. That makes sense. That might be great for my social media presence. It might be awful for my family experience, especially depending on what I'm talking about on social media. Let's think about the business model underneath social media. And this is a short article from Yale Insights around social media use and regulators, where the business model under social media is about generating usage. The more you use, the more connected you are to social media, the more data you provide so that businesses can sell that information for targeted marketing and advertising. There's a business platform underneath social media. The business platform is not about bringing families together. It's not necessarily about bringing family or taking families apart or separating families, but what it is based on is usage. And unfortunately, extreme conversations, extreme discussions will sometimes generate usage that is high in nature, so it might be great for profitability, but might actually be harmful. So this particular piece from Yale Insights talks about the potential for regulation and seeing, are there harms associated with using social media? And I say in particular, when it comes to the family relationship, knowing that family members are going to have potentially a diversity of perspectives, how do we maintain love, trust, fallibility, humility, and connectedness, even when we disagree? Social media might be a place that could be a facilitator of connection for you and your family. It may be an area that actually is causing some discomfort or some distance between family members. Give that some thought in some conversations with your family around how do you make social media work for you and your family as opposed to causing harm. This will be an ongoing conversation, whether we have it at the Royal or whether we have it anywhere else in the world. Social media and the internet are not going away. Social media is an important part of modern life, but how do we move from the quick, extreme sell, extreme position? How do we move back to the dialectic? How do we move back to validating our family members, even when we don't necessarily agree with them? And how do we make sure that we're living our best lives with both ourselves and our families? Life's hard. I think it's going to be connection that's going to help us get through. And I think connection oftentimes starts with the family unit. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope you found this educational session helpful.